You're listening to the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Bill McIntyre, and it's time for this week's Long Island News, the show that talks to newsmakers and other important people from Nassau and Suffolk County that matter to Long Island and Long Islanders like you. So each week we'll have a conversation about issues that affect all of us. I live on Long Island just like you, and I do want to know more about the people making the big decisions that affect all of us. Well, this week we are partnering with our friends at Newsday and Newsday.com to get the latest on a story they've been following for a few weeks now concerning the former Grumman Aerospace dumping ground at Bethpage Community Park and the news that laboratory testing on the contents of the first 16 of 22 chemical drums recently unearthed showed results consistent with what's already known about the pollution at the site. Well, the story was written by Joseph Ostapiuk, and he's joining us by Zoom this week to give us the details. Welcome to this week's Long Island News.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for taking the time. I know you guys are busy. Always looking at something, right?
Yeah.
Well, now, for those that don't know, can you tell us briefly about the history of contamination at Bethpage?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm starting in the 40s, going all the way through the 60s. Bethpage Community Park, what we know it as now as Bethpage Community Park, was a dumping ground for Grumman Aerospace, weapons manufacturer, aircraft that manufacturer. That dumping ground including soaked rag pits and sludge drying beds, and that created what was a major contributor to what we know now as the Bethpage plume.
The Bethpage plume. Is this thing ever going away?
Not in our lifetimes.
Right. So now tell us what the laboratory testing, what did they find was buried? What was actually in the drums?
Sure. So to start, this laboratory testing was for the first 16 drums that were found at this site. If you don't mind, I'll just go through a little bit briefly so the listeners understand how many drums there are and how they were found. So this site has been in remediation for a little bit. The town of Oyster Bay actually sued Northrop Grumman in 2023, criticizing the pace, the thoroughness of this cleanup, saying it's taking too long and it's not thorough enough. So while contractors for Northrop Grumman were digging wells for this remediation at the site, they encountered concrete that they did not expect. And then that was in late March. The town is notified of this. And then in early April, we did the report that 6 concrete encased 55-gallon chemical drums were found at the site. It's obviously a bit of a surprise. The town was frustrated because, as we had mentioned, this remediation had been going on for a little bit. And then when that layer was being removed, they found a second layer of an additional 4 concrete encased chemical drums. And then the next day, another 6 were found below that. This is extending from about 7 feet below the surface all the way down to about 13 feet below the surface. They're in these columns of concrete that were put one on top of the other. So that's the first 16 drums that were found. Later on, a pit about 20 feet away found an additional 6 drums. But this testing is on those first 16 drums. It took a little bit to get this because we're talking about taking them out of the ground in mid-April, and we're now in late May. These results came out this week. But to start, you had mentioned it already at the onset, but this site is contaminated. It's obviously the focus of a remediation. And the Department of Environmental Conservation, which is the agency that's overseeing all of this, said that they expected what was in the drums to match what was outside the drums. Now, none of these drums leaked, the DEC has said, which is obviously good news. But like I said, the area surrounding it's still contaminated. Right. Getting to what's in the drums, there are 4 main components. Something called VOCs, which are volatile organic compounds, SVOCs, semi-volatile organic compounds, metals, and PCBs. All 4 of them were found in varying drums. Some of them had just VOCs and SVOCs, and they had a mix of different things. I spoke with an expert over at Farmingdale, and he spoke to me a little bit about these. Essentially, many of these chemicals just don't break down in the environment. So in other words, they'll stay there for a very long time. And they don't break down in the drums. So they just were essentially sitting there now for decades. If they do leak, that expert tells me that they get into the environment, and that's how they contaminate groundwater, soil. They can even contaminate animals, and then down the line contaminate people if we, intake the water, or,
Right.
I mean, I don't think anybody's eating food, animals that are walking around Bethpage, but,
Yeah.
but obviously that's an issue there as well. So those are the main, 4 categories that the DEC found in this testing. Some of the chemicals, I think people would know. Some of them, it's just sort of a mishmash of words to
Right.
the everyday person. But some of the metals that they found: arsenic, cadmium, lead, mercury, silver. The expert that I spoke with, his quote to me was, "None of those are good."
Right.
So and PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, they are included in there, and they also contain what the EPA considers are possible human carcinogens. So it runs the chemical gamut. There's a lot sort of just shoved in chemical drums, put in concrete around it, and then put in the ground for a pretty long time.
Okay, so it was discovered accidentally?
Yeah, essentially, these contractors, they dig these wells to monitor soil quality and do a whole bunch of other things, part of this ongoing remediation effort. But in that process is when they hit these drums, these concrete blocks, which town is obviously frustrated at. And the interesting thing was, after those first 3 layers were found, the DEC ordered Northrop Grumman's contractor to conduct ground penetrating radar scans of the entire ball field area of the site. So they do that, and they find what they call anomalies. For days, we're trying to figure out, what does that mean? Like, what are anomalies?
They're not good. I think they're not good.
So it ended up being some pretty innocuous materials, a storm sewer grade, a metal pipe, a concrete. So it was nothing, really. And then a few days later, the DEC said that they had found 6 more drums, but they did not find them using the ground penetrating radar. They used old aerial photographs of the site. And based on that, they said, these are some areas we think the company could have buried things. So the town was once again frustrated. How do we get to a point where we did a ground penetrating radar scan of the site and not find this? When this initially happened, I asked the DEC, who's the oversight agency here, what did, how did this happen, essentially? How did the scans happen? You don't find this. And their initial response to me was, we're asking Northrop Grumman the same thing. So that's sort of where things stood at that time.
Actually, it strangely feels kind of good that the contractor that Northrop Grumman themselves hired are the ones that found the smoking gun, so to speak. Right? I mean, their own people. Are these guys still working for Northrop? I would imagine they would have been fired the next day for,
Yeah. So I mean, it is interesting. I spoke to a former federal environmental administrator, and she was talking to me about some of how this process works, and in these cases, the former polluter in a lot is the company that's responsible for the cleanup, and that puts a lot of onus on the regulatory agencies, in this case the DEC, to ensure that they're doing the right thing.
Right.
Because there's a financial incentive for companies to not bind things, because it costs a lot of money.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the balancing act that's happening here. The town's very frustrated, obviously engaged in a lawsuit. And the DEC is oversight agency to this, and Northrop has to be the one. Northrop's contractors, so Northrop by extension, has to be the one to look for this stuff and make sure that it's being cleaned. And it was already sort of a frustrating spot for the town beforehand, but after all this, I mean, it seems to have boiled over.
I mean, I think it's kind of strange. Let's just say, and we can talk hypothetically for kicks, Northrop did this. So they knew, and it wasn't Northrop that told people that they were there.
Yeah. So I mean, I think.
Here's my point.
Understand.
Are they saying they forgot?
That's a good point. I mean, this site, first of all, I mean, the former company Grumman Aerospace was acquired by the Northrop Corporation in the mid 90s. So that was well after the dumping had occurred, and we don't really know when these drums were buried. That's another thing too. I mean, we don't have solid information on that. It's worth noting that in 2016, we reported, my colleague Paul Aracco reported that a whistleblower had told the DEC that drums are buried at this site, and the DEC at that time didn't find anything. And So that was something that was somewhat known even in sort of recent history within the past decade,
Right.
that may have been something that happens here. And, the DC has said repeatedly, like, stuff like this isn't exactly surprising when you're talking about cleaning up old manufacturing sites.
But that makes
But at
their
the
case worse. They
Well, that's
know
the thing.
it's bad, and still, oh well, la-di-da, we'll talk to the next guy. Whatever, it's amazing. I was stunned that Northrop wasn't the ones that came. Okay, that's what's weird about it. They hired the contractor that basically outed them, and yet they should have known. I mean, even if the total employment, if the employment was totally different, if all the people were different, new president, new company name, and oftentimes companies will do this to disavow, anything that happened before such and such a date. But Northrop Grumman, those are the guys that brought us to the moon. That's supposed to be America and apple pie and all that stuff. And then you bury your dirty laundry in the neighborhood somewhere and don't tell anybody?
Yeah, we've spoken about that actually pretty often. Just the sort of reputation. I mean, this is before my time, but that Grumman had on Long Island.
Oh.
I mean, a major employer, like sterling reputation.
Yes.
And just how that's sort of changed in recent years, but to some don't feel any differently about them. I mean, because I guess as I mentioned, it was a major employer. It was a good employer for Long Island. Thousands upon thousands of people employed, and people who worked there loved working there. That was something that everybody said.
I remember it well. I grew up on, and I knew quite a few people who worked at Grumman, but, as we look back, though, they did great things, no doubt about it. But you put those on a scale and, you can't do that. I don't care what great thing you did. You screwed us. For generations too, and those the things you're talking about, like dioxin and the thing, it takes one particle, and you'll carry that in your lung or somewhere for 30 years, and then all of a sudden the alarm goes off. And
our past investigation that we did a while back, it was in the last decade, when we spoke about how long they were aware of the pollution and didn't do anything about it, and how it grew to this size, and we're talking about 4 miles long, 2 miles wide, 900 feet deep.
And it's moving a foot a day, they say?
A foot a day, yeah. My colleague Tracy Toulis just did that report. I mean, moving a foot a day and, continuing to try to be contained. But everybody that we had spoke to said if we had just started to address this earlier, it wouldn't have spread to the level that it did. And obviously Long Island, it's a concern because sole source aquifer. And Long Island's a little bit of a different place than a lot of other municipalities that have contamination, because some of those areas could be rocky and it could be different types of soil where things don't permeate as much. We're essentially on a sandbar that's sitting on top of an aquifer. So that's why it's a much different beast for Long Islanders.
Yeah, and it just seems such a shame. Long Island has such a unique water system, and it's always been so good. And it just, if I were to project, I'd think, and we're going to ruin it. Hopefully technology comes up with a way to desalinate seawater faster and cheaper, because eventually I think Long Island will be looking at that.
Yeah, there's concerns about just how often we use water and what we use that aquifer for. I mean, we use the aquifer for a lot of things that necessarily don't require the cleanest water that we have. So, I mean, it's questions that we're going to have to think about. And of course, pollution doesn't make it any easier.
Yeah, right. You're listening to this week's Long Island News on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Bill McIntyre, and my guest today is Joseph Ostapiuk from Newsday and Newsday.com to get the latest on the former Grumman Aerospace dumping ground at Bethpage Community Park. If this was you or me, we'd be talking about criminal charges. We wouldn't be talking about who's paying for it. That's one of the glaring things in all of these things when it comes to companies. They seem to get a pass on things that you would be thrown in the slammer for in 10 minutes. It's just amazing to me. And the other thing is that there have been kids playing on that playground for the last 50 years. I played on that playground playing baseball, and, it's just mind-blowing to think that, was that like, that's what they used to say about nuclear waste. If we encase it in concrete and dump it in the ground, we don't have to worry about it. Well, with a half-life of 250,000 years, I think maybe you didn't think that through,
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that's interesting, I'll touch first on sort of the efforts. I mean, it appears, that obviously these drums are put in concrete. It's a deliberate, obviously, effort. Not incredibly clear right now. Like, something we don't know is why these drums specifically were put in concrete when obviously they had been dumping in the ground directly for a long time beforehand. So I mean, it is an unanswered question that I think about often. Like, because
do you think after the fact it makes them look responsible?
Well, I mean, the thing that's interesting is that obviously these weren't found 100 years after they were dumped, but luckily they didn't leak. All the concrete encasements held them. But as I mentioned before, I mean, these chemicals are never going to go anywhere. Yeah. It's not like they'll just over time just dissipate. It just doesn't work like that with these chemicals. I mean, they require a diligent effort. When I spoke with the Farmingdale professor, he told me at their chemistry department, when they have to get rid of chemicals like this, you have to very specifically encase the chemicals individually, and then you send them to a site that deals with these chemicals so that they can deal with them individually. In other words, you would never put multiple chemicals together because it becomes very difficult to chemically break them down. So, when I asked him about this, what this type of practice is, it's just irresponsible, obviously. The only thing is they didn't directly just throw the drums in the ground, which surely would have leaked because they just the encasements wouldn't have lasted that long. But yeah, it's an interesting question of sort of why these ones specifically were done like this and how they were done very methodically. I mean, this isn't like, your contractor down the block just throwing some stuff in the ground.
This wasn't an oops.
It wasn't an oops.
Right, right.
I mean, I think you could definitely draw the connection that the company was very deliberate about this. You have to cast the concrete encasements, get the drums inside of them, put and then do all that. And we're talking about 13 feet below the ground. It's not something you can dig really with a shovel. So, definitely an effort. And going back to what you had mentioned, I mean, in the process of covering this story, I'd spoken to a lot of people who live around it. I think as journalists, the thing we try to do is talk to the stakeholders.
Right.
And the stakeholders in this case are really the people who live there. And we get wrapped up sometimes talking to Northrop Grumman, talking to the DEC, talking to the town, but the people are the ones who want the park. It's their park. I spoke to a woman who had 2 children. She lives probably 500 feet from the park, and she wasn't even aware 2 days after the drums were found that this is actually 2 days after we reported it. It was been about a week after the drums were found. She wasn't even aware that was the case. She was frustrated that they didn't receive a mailer. People are busy, so not everybody's keeping up with the news every single day. She has 2 young kids. She got a lot of things going on, but she was frustrated that they didn't even send a mailer out to the people within a mile of the. There's a company with a lot of money. Obviously, they could afford a pamphlet.
Yeah.
So she was frustrated about that. And I went to a rally in Bethpage. This was now a few weeks ago, where residents were just calling for this process to be picked up. When I spoke to a lot of different people who are concerned about the remediation, but the real thing is they're just frustrated. There's an overwhelming sense of frustration at the park. And for the people who live in Bethpage, they just want this done. It's been a long time for them. I mean, they had a young woman go up there. I think she was 21 or 22 years old, and she had never been in the ball field. She'd never been able to play softball or baseball at the park because it's been closed for her entire life. Wow. So it really put an image up there of this is how long this has been.
Right.
Old people who were there who were older, the 40s, 50s, they were able to talk about, I used to play here.
Right.
And they were concerned about that too, obviously, because they were what they were playing on top of. But there's a whole generation now that hasn't been able to do it. And unfortunately, with these recent discoveries, it doesn't look like it's going to be happening, next month.
Right. Anytime soon. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I remember there was a story going around, and I'm also familiar with, I don't know if you're familiar with Motor Avenue in Farmingdale. Oh, they had quite a few companies in there, and it goes back to probably before the 20s. They used to have a photo engraving place there, and all of those businesses along that strip on Motor Avenue were dumping their stuff in the ground. From asbestos, they used to make asbestos tubes for oil drilling. And so all of that waste went there. Now there's got to be a plume from Motor Avenue heading south also. But anyway, there was a story about a lady who complained, and she complained so much, consistently complained. And finally she got like the guy on the phone who can answer my question. And he said, I'll tell you what, lady, this is a story now. So I'm not a journalist. Okay. But he basically said, listen, lady, this is never going to get cleaned. and your constant complaining, if we take you up on what you want us to do, we're basically going to bulldoze every house from Motor Avenue all the way to Jones Beach, because that's the only way that we could declare that it is safe. That's more than disheartening. I can't even think of the word, to think that the whole island is basically poisoned.
Yeah, the effort to contain the plume now is pretty significant and interesting scientifically, but you can never get over the fact that if it had just been done 20, 30 years earlier, it would have been such a much more manageable effort. And as the case with anything when it comes to the environment, if you were proactive about it, it would have been far cheaper. Well, that's the big thing. I mean, this stuff costs massive amounts of money. We're talking about thousands of tons of contaminants that have to be removed. And if you had just done it earlier, it would have been a lot more effective. But there's so many overlaying things to this, politics and power. And I think that's why people are interested in it, then because it's where they live and something that, that concerns them. Yeah, yeah. Well,
now we're seeing the Goliaths battle it out. And getting nowhere. That's right. It's great theater. Everybody, Northrop said this. Oh, the government said that. And and for 50 years, we've been reading this tennis, game back and forth. We deserve better. We really deserve better.
Yeah, that's been the sentiment that, the town has said. And even the DEC has said that, they're, while they said, oh, this is expected, they're also saying in the same breath that this is frustrating. It's taken too long. We're trying to, push this forward, but there just hasn't been really solid results on that effort yet.
Do you think it's? Is there the bottom line fear that no matter what we do, we ain't fixing this?
I think the DC is confident that that with the wells that they've already dug, which essentially remove contaminants from it at the outer edge of it, and the wells that they're going to dig, because that process isn't even done yet, that they could continue to address it or try to contain it. But as I mentioned, it's not a question, I think, as much of is it possible. It's going to cost an absurd amount of money, an incredible amount of money.
Are all these, backflips and jumping jacks, is that really just theater for us? We're doing something. Yeah, we're doing something.
Yeah, with any story, you got to cut through the noise. And in this case, I definitely recognize that there are major players at play. Northrop Grumman is a incredibly powerful organization. The DEC has a lot of oversight power, obviously in New York, overseeing the Superfund sites, and those efforts are often very thorny, not just with the government, but with the communities that they're in. So there's a lot at play here, and there's a lot of people that are, trying to come out of this in the best light possible. I don't know if that's possible for a company like Northrop Grumman. I'm not on the PR end, so it doesn't really concern me as much. But and even the town too. I mean, they have a stake in this game. Obviously, an ongoing lawsuit. And the town has overtly said to me that, some of this stuff is evidence for them now in that lawsuit. So that's going to be something to watch moving forward as well.
Interesting. Just thinking, forward thinking a little, if I found out that I could outfit Long Island with desalinization equipment and that would cost billions less than fixing this, you see the problem?
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying.
I wonder.
I wonder. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not familiar on the technology, but I think that the state also has an obligation at this point, to address the contamination.
Right, but the first effects that we're going to see, and I can almost guarantee we're going to see them, and we may be seeing them now. I mean, if we looked at a map of cancer rates, Long Island is not at the bottom of the list. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We're up there.
Yeah, it's always been difficult because my previous job was in Staten Island, so I had obviously covered a lot with the landfill that's over there, and as in case on Long Island, and many times it was difficult to directly tie landfill cancers to people who had cancer. Right. But, at the same time, I had covered lawsuits of individuals who lived all on the same block and had incredibly rare cancers, percentage wise, and they lived within eyesight of that former landfill, which is now Fresh Kills Park.
Right.
So, I mean, it's an interesting thing because the people who live there say one thing, the agencies that oversee it don't always validate it, but it doesn't at all discourage the people, because everybody who I spoke to at that Bethpage rally, I have X number of people who I know who have cancer. You know, my sister has cancer, my brother has cancer, my mother died of cancer. So that's another thorny element of this.
Yeah. Well, at some point, anecdotal evidence kind of becomes evidence, you know?
Yeah, that's exactly what the people who in Bethpage say. I mean, so many people have been come down with cancer, some of them rare, that they don't, normally expect, and they were playing on this park.
Yeah, there's a few pages on Facebook I know of that are people banded together that, talk about this stuff. But yeah, you want to talk about frustration. And think about the other thing. Those are just the people that put the evidence together that they had. How many generations before them have been affected? How many grandmas and grandpas already passed from years ago? Yeah. And who knows from what?
Yeah, I mean, it's sometimes it's difficult to remember the scale of this. I mean, for the dumping itself took place over 2 decades, but the 60s are now a while ago. So there's some time between now and then that we've seen some generations pass, and for years after the 60s, we really didn't even know about the extent of this contamination and what it was, where it was and what it was doing to the drinking water and things like that.
Yeah. Well, we could keep talking. I know I'll think of a question every 10 seconds, but just for you, anything else you just want to tell people, any stories that you're working on or anything, go for it. It's all yours.
Well, I mean, I think one thing regarding this to sort of the next step, like, well, what's going to happen next at Bethpage? I think it's important. People are thinking about, as I mentioned, the test results were for the first 16 drums. So we are expecting at some point to get the last 6 drums that were found. So far the DC said it's what's expected, but we'll see what happens there. Another thing too that'll be happening possibly in the coming weeks, likely sometime in June, is that Northrop Grumman hired a new contractor, an additional contractor, to conduct new ground penetrating radar scans at the site. I've been told that that's going to be something that it is happening likely sometime in June, possibly the middle of June. And that company is specifically outfitting their equipment to deal with the terrain and the other conditions at this site. I mean, that's something that the town has wanted for a bit, that because of obviously how the past 6 drums weren't found with ground penetrating radar. So they, it calls into question the rest of the scan of the park. Yeah, right. So they want to be sure at this point there is nothing else under the ground. So that could, give us a little bit more insight if there's any more, and or if there aren't.
Could be a whole nother can of worms. Well,
it could be,
or a bigger can of worms, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah, we're already a few cans of worms in.
My guest today has been Joseph Ostapiuk from Newsday and Newsday.com. We want to thank you for taking the time to be here to speak with us, and you'll have to promise to get back to us when you have some more updates.
Yes, of course. We'll be happy to be on.
The clock on the wall says it's time for this week's Long Island News to get on out of here. I'm Bill McIntyre. Remember, you can listen to us by searching for this week's Long Island News wherever you listen to podcasts, and we're right here every Friday at 3 p.m. on the radio on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.